January 12, 1945, Stalag Ixi, Bad Sulza, Germany. The American nurse stood motionless in the snow, her breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. She was pointing at the wooden crate the guard had just dropped at her feet. Her lips moved, forming a single word in broken German. The guard laughed, harsh and cold. Then his face changed. The laughter died. He looked at the crate again, then at her trembling hand, and something in his expression cracked like ice over deep water. In that moment he realized these weren't prisoners. They were witnesses. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten story, if you're finding this as powerful as we hope, please hit the like button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These stories matter because someone lived them, someone survived them, and someone needs to remember. Your engagement helps us keep these voices alive. Now, let's return to that frozen morning in January, to a moment that would haunt one German guard for the rest of his life. The nurse didn't move. She just stood there, pointing at the crate. Inside were Red Cross parcels, chocolate bars, powdered milk, tinned meat, food they hadn't seen in weeks. But she wasn't pointing at the food. She was pointing at the wood itself, at the way the crate had been nailed shut. Her hands were too weak to pry it open. Her fingers, frostbitten and swollen, couldn't grip the nails. The guard had expected gratitude. What he received instead was a quiet, devastating request. Help me open it. That simple gesture, that outstretched hand, broke something inside him that propaganda had spent years building. Act 1. The context of captivity. By the winter of 1945, Germany held more than 95,000 American prisoners of war. Among them were over 200 women, most of them nurses captured in North Africa, Italy, and the Philippines. They had been sent to camps across occupied Europe, places designed for men, for soldiers, for enemies. But the women posed a different problem. They weren't combatants in the traditional sense. They carried no weapons. They had healed, not killed, and yet they wore the uniform of the United States Army. That alone made them dangerous. The Nazi regime had built its identity on rigid hierarchies of race, gender, and power. Women belonged in the home, in service to the state, silent and obedient. American women in uniform shattered that narrative. They were educated, independent, and skilled. Worse, they refused to break. Propaganda had painted American soldiers as soft, cowardly, spoiled by luxury. But these women endured starvation, cold, and disease without collapsing. That resilience terrified their captors more than any weapon could. Lieutenant Margaret Hastings had been captured in September 1944 after her transport plane crash-landed behind enemy lines in Yugoslavia. She was one of 12 nurses taken prisoner and moved through a network of camps before arriving at Stalag Ixi. The conditions were brutal. Wooden barracks with gaps in the walls, straw mattresses crawling with lice, a single stove for 60 women. Food rations consisted of watery soup, black bread, and occasionally potato peels. By January, her weight had dropped from 135 pounds to 89. But it wasn't the hunger that wore her down. It was the isolation. The camp was designed to break spirits, not bodies. Guards rotated constantly, ensuring no relationships formed. Mail was withheld for months. News from the outside world was forbidden. The women existed in a vacuum of uncertainty, not knowing if their families believed them alive, not knowing if anyone was coming. that psychological warfare was deliberate. The Nazis understood that hope, once extinguished, was harder to reignite than a fire in winter. And yet hope persisted. The nurses organized in secret. They held classes teaching French, mathematics, and poetry. They fashioned calendars from scraps of paper, marking each day as proof they were still counting. They saved breadcrumbs to feed sparrows through the cracks in the barracks, because watching something else survive gave them reason to continue. These small acts of defiance weren't rebellion in the traditional sense. They were assertions of humanity in a place designed to erase it. Then came the Red Cross parcels. The first delivery arrived on January 10th. 2 crates dropped unceremoniously in the snow. The women had heard rumors of such packages, but many believed they were myths, propaganda designed to placate the Allies. When the guards pried open the crates and the smell of chocolate filled the air, several women wept, not from joy, but from the shock of realizing they had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. That moment of sensory memory was more disorienting than the hunger itself. But the parcels came with conditions. The guards controlled distribution. They opened every package, inspecting contents, removing anything deemed contraband. Letters, photographs, even shoelaces were confiscated. The process was slow, deliberate, designed to humiliate. The women stood in line for hours in sub-zero temperatures, watching as guards ate the chocolate intended for them, laughing as they smeared butter on their own bread. It was cruelty disguised as procedure, punishment wrapped in bureaucracy. On the morning of January 12th, the 3rd crate arrived. Lieutenant Hastings was at the front of the line. She had been awake since dawn, her body shaking from cold and anticipation. When the guard dropped the crate at her feet, she stared at it. The nails were driven deep, the wood warped from moisture. She tried to pry it open with her fingers, but they wouldn't bend. Frostbite had stolen her dexterity. She looked up at the guard, a young man barely 20. His face still round with youth. She pointed at the crate, then at his hands. The request was silent but clear. The guard's laughter came first, instinctive and mocking. Then it stopped. Act 2. The moment of recognition. He had laughed because he was trained to. Propaganda films had shown him American soldiers as weak, dependent, incapable of enduring hardship. The nurses were supposed to be even softer, pampered women playing at war. But the woman standing before him didn't match the caricature. Her uniform hung loose on her frame, but her posture remained straight. Her eyes didn't plead. They simply waited. That quiet dignity unsettled him more than anger or tears ever could. The guard's name was Franz Keller, a farmhand from Bavaria conscripted in 1943. He had never wanted to be a soldier. He had wanted to tend crops, marry the girl from the neighboring village, and live a life measured in seasons, not battles. But the war had other plans. By 1945 he had seen too much. Burned villages, frozen corpses, orders that turned his stomach. He told himself he was just following commands, that survival required obedience. But standing in the snow, watching this woman's frostbitten fingers fail to grip the nails, something inside him broke. He knelt down. Without a word, he pulled the crate toward him and began prying the nails loose with the butt of his rifle. The wood splintered. The lid came free. Inside were tins of meat, packets of biscuits, bars of soap. He stepped back, not meeting her eyes. Lieutenant Hastings reached into the crate slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter the moment. She pulled out a tin, examined it, then looked at the guard. She nodded once. Not gratitude, acknowledgement. He nodded back. Then he walked away, his boots crunching in the snow, his hands shaking. That night, Franz couldn't sleep. He lay in the guards' barracks, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. He had opened a crate, a simple act, but it felt like betrayal. Not of Germany, but of the version of himself he had been forced to become. The propaganda had taught him that kindness was weakness, that compassion was dangerous. But the woman's face kept returning to him. She hadn't begged. She hadn't manipulated. She had simply asked for help opening a box, and he had given it. That terrified him. The other guards noticed his silence. They mocked him, calling him soft, accusing him of sympathizing with the enemy. Franz said nothing. He couldn't explain what he'd felt. How could he tell them that in that moment he hadn't seen an enemy? He had seen his sister, his mother, his neighbor. He had seen a human being, and recognizing that humanity meant acknowledging everything else he had been ordered to ignore. The women noticed, too. Word spread quickly through the barracks. The guard who helped. The one who didn't laugh. Lieutenant Hastings shared the contents of the crate, rationing the food carefully. But the real gift wasn't the chocolate or the soap. It was the knowledge that not every guard was a monster. That even in a place designed to dehumanize, small acts of decency could still occur. That realization was more sustaining than calories. Days passed. The routine continued. Roll calls in the frozen dawn. Watery soup. Silence. But something had shifted. Franz began distributing parcels differently. He stopped confiscating letters. He loosened the lids on crates before dropping them. Small gestures invisible to his superiors but noticed by the women. He never spoke to them. He never smiled. But his actions spoke louder than words. He was risking his life bit by bit, nail by nail. Other guards began to change too. Not all of them, but enough. A corporal started allowing the women to stand closer to the stove. Another forgot to confiscate a photograph tucked inside a parcel. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were cracks in the armor of obedience. Each small kindness was an admission that the propaganda had lied, that the enemy wasn't inhuman, that war had turned men into machines, but machines could remember how to be men. By late January, the camp dynamics had shifted subtly. The cruelty remained, but it was no longer absolute. The women began to test the boundaries. They sang quietly at night, American songs that drifted through the barracks. The guards didn't stop them. They asked for medical supplies, and sometimes they received them. Not enough. Never enough. But the act of asking and occasionally receiving restored something intangible. Agency, voice, proof that they still existed. Then came the order. On February 3rd, the camp commandant announced that all Red Cross parcels would be withheld indefinitely. The women's rations would be reduced further. No explanation was given, but the reason was clear. The war was turning. Germany was collapsing. Resources were scarce. The prisoners were expendable. Franz heard the order and felt his stomach turn. He knew what reduced rations meant. Starvation, death, and he knew he couldn't stop it. Act 3. The choice. That night, Franz made a decision. He couldn't defy the order openly. That would mean execution. But he could act in the margins, in the spaces where no one was watching. He began stealing food from the guard's kitchen. Small amounts, nothing that would be missed immediately. A loaf of bread, a tin of lard. potatoes still crusted with dirt. He wrapped them in cloth and hid them in the woodshed near the women's barracks. He didn't tell anyone. He simply left the bundles where they could be found. The first time Lieutenant Hastings discovered the bread while gathering kindling, she looked around, saw no one, and carried it inside. The women ate in silence, tearing pieces with their hands, chewing slowly. They didn't know who had left it, but they knew it was a gift, and gifts in that place were miracles. Franz continued for 3 weeks. Each time, the risk grew. Food shortages were affecting everyone. Theft was punishable by death, but he couldn't stop. The act of giving had become his only anchor to the person he used to be. The farmhand who shared his harvest, the son who brought his mother apples, the boy who believed kindness mattered. War had tried to erase that boy, but the woman pointing at the crate had reminded him he was still there, buried but alive. On February 24th, he was caught. Another guard found him in the kitchen, wrapping bread in cloth. Franz didn't run. He didn't lie. He just stood there, the bread in his hands, waiting. The guard stared at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Franz exhaled, his entire body shaking. The guard had made a choice, too, to see and to look away, to know and to stay silent. In a system built on obedience, that silence was an act of rebellion. The war ended 11 weeks later. On April 6, 1945, American forces liberated Stalag Ixi. The women emerged from the barracks, blinking in the sunlight, skeletal and hollow-eyed. Lieutenant Hastings weighed 81 pounds. She could barely walk, but she was alive. They all were. Against impossible odds, through starvation and cold and despair, they had survived. And when the Red Cross workers arrived with hot soup and blankets, the women wept. Not from relief, but from the overwhelming weight of realizing they had made it, that they had outlasted the machine designed to break them. Franz was arrested along with the other guards. He was held for 3 months while investigators sorted through testimonies. The women were interviewed. Many spoke of brutality, of guards who had delighted in cruelty, but several mentioned the one who had helped, the one who loosened the lids, the one who left bread in the woodshed. Lieutenant Hastings testified on his behalf. She didn't excuse the camp. She didn't minimize the suffering. But she told the truth, that in the darkest place she had ever known, one man had chosen differently, and that choice had mattered. Franz was released in July. He returned to Bavaria, to the farm that no longer existed. The fields had been bombed. His family scattered. The girl he had wanted to marry had married someone else. He rebuilt slowly, quietly, never speaking of the war. But he kept one thing, a letter from Lieutenant Hastings, written in careful English. It said only this: "You gave me back my humanity when I thought I had lost it. I will never forget." He folded it carefully and placed it in a wooden box, alongside his father's watch and his mother's rosary. The things that mattered: resolution, the echo of kindness. The story of Stalag Ixi is not widely known. It doesn't appear in most history books. There are no monuments, no plaques, but the women who survived never forgot. They carried those memories into their lives, into their families, into the way they moved through the world. Lieutenant Margaret Hastings became a nurse educator, spending 40 years teaching young women the skills that had kept her alive. She never spoke publicly about the camp, but in private to students who asked, she would say this: Even in the worst places, humanity persists. Not always, not everywhere, but sometimes in small moments it finds a way. The German guard who laughed, then stopped, represents something uncomfortable. The idea that cruelty isn't innate, that it's taught, enforced, and sustained by systems, and that those systems can be resisted, even in tiny ways. Franz Keller wasn't a hero. He didn't save everyone. He didn't stop the war. But he opened a crate. He left bread in a woodshed. He made choices that in aggregate meant survival for women who had been written off as expendable. That matters. Not because it erases the horror, but because it complicates it. Because it reminds us that even in machines of death, individuals still make choices. The nurses of Stalag XC returned home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with them. They weren't celebrated like combat soldiers. Their captivity wasn't cinematic. It was slow, grinding, invisible suffering, but they endured. They taught each other French in the cold. They saved breadcrumbs for sparrows. They pointed at crates and asked for help. And sometimes, against all odds, help came. Not from systems, not from armies, but from one young man in the snow whose hands remembered how to be kind. Decades later, historians would uncover documents showing that Red Cross parcels were often withheld or stolen by camp personnel, that the food meant for prisoners ended up feeding guards, sold on black markets, or left to rot in storage. The system was designed to extract maximum suffering for minimum cost. But the system wasn't absolute. Individuals, even within it, found ways to subvert. A loosened lid, a forgotten photograph, a bundle of bread hidden in the woodshed. These weren't grand gestures. They were pinpricks of light in absolute darkness. But light, no matter how small, is still light. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. These stories survive only when we remember them, when we carry them forward, when we refuse to let them disappear. The women of Stalag XC deserve to be remembered. So does the guard who stopped laughing and started listening. Because history isn't just the battles. It's the moments in between. The crate in the snow. The hand that opened it. The choice made once that echoed forever. They survived not because the world was kind, but because they refused to let it make them cruel. That refusal, quiet and uncheckable, is the truest victory. And it began with a woman pointing at a crate, and a man who realized, too late and just in time, that kindness costs nothing and changes everything.